when hospitality became an act of defiance. Hospitality is supposed to be neutral, welcoming, safe, but in one restaurant, it became something far more dangerous. It became a line drawn quietly and then held, even as the world pushed back. The restaurant opened during a moment of tightening rules. New regulations shaped who could gather, how long they could stay, and what kind of presence was considered acceptable. Most places adjusted quickly, streamlining service, shortening stays, encouraging efficiency. This restaurant did the opposite. To understand why, we have to understand what hospitality once meant. Before metrics and margins, hospitality was protection, a promise that inside these walls you'd be fed, allowed to rest, and not questioned too closely. It was never about comfort alone. It was about dignity. The owner had grown up around tables where food was offered without condition. You ate first, explained later. If at all, when he opened his restaurant, he carried that belief forward instinctively. Guests were not rushed. No one was asked why they stayed so long. Conversations were allowed to stretch past usefulness. At first, it felt unremarkable. Then the city changed. New expectations arrived disguised as efficiency. Tables were timed. Gatherings discouraged. Certain guests were made to feel like problems rather than people. The owner noticed patterns. Who was asked to move along? Who was watched more closely? Who was made to feel temporary? So he made a decision. Everyone was welcome to stay. No time limits. No minimum spend. No questions asked. The policy was never posted. It was practice. Staff were instructed to refill water without prompting, to ignore the clock, to treat lingering not as loss, but as purpose. The dining room slowed. Meals stretched into hours. Some guests came just to sit. Word spread. For some, the restaurant became a refuge. For others, it became an irritation. Critics questioned sustainability. Advisors warned of abuse. Regulators began paying attention. Hospitality, it turned out, was only acceptable when it remained efficient. And without raising its voice, this restaurant had done something radical. It had refused to hurry people. That refusal would soon be tested. Because when hospitality stops serving the system notices. The pressure arrived through paperwork. Notices about occupancy. Reminders about turnover. Suggestions framed as compliance rather than command. The language was careful, almost friendly, but the intent was clear. Lingering was being reclassified as inefficiency. Inefficiency as risk. The owner listened politely and changed nothing. Inside the dining room, the effects of the policy deepened. Regulars learned they could stay without apology. New guests sensed it immediately, the absence of subtle cues to leave. No hovering, no rush checks, no glances at the door. Time loosened. People exhaled. Some stayed for hours without ordering much. Others ordered slowly, thoughtfully, grateful for the space. Conversations grew layered. Arguments softened. Decisions were made at the table that had nothing to do with food. The restaurant had become a holding place in a city that offered few. Staff noticed the difference. At first, they worried. Long stays meant fewer tables turned. But something else happened. Guests tipped more generously. Not out of obligation, but appreciation. Staff felt less like enforcers and more like caretakers. The work grew heavier emotionally, but lighter in spirit. Not everyone approved. A columnist wrote that the restaurant encouraged loitering, that hospitality without limits invited disorder. Online comments followed, accusing the owner of naivety. The suggestion surfaced repeatedly. Hospitality must have boundaries to function. Then came the inspection. Nothing was technically wrong. The restaurant was clean, compliant, calm, but the inspector lingered, observing the room. Guests who had been there all afternoon were still there. The owner sensed a question before it was asked. The owner answered honestly. The silence that followed carried weight. The issue was no longer policy. It was philosophy. The restaurant had crossed from business into statement, not by declaring anything, but by practicing care in a way that resisted efficiency. Warnings followed. Potential fines were mentioned. Advisors urged compromise. They suggested soft limits, Posted guidelines, gentle nudges. The owner considered them, knowing each would dilute the one thing that made the place matter. The conflict sharpened. Could hospitality remain unconditional inside a system built on conditions? The owner knew the next move would decide whether the space could continue offering refuge or whether Defiance, no matter how quiet, would be forced into retreat. The answer was coming, and it would demand more than good intentions to hold the door open. The confrontation arrived without drama. A formal notice requested a meeting, not a shutdown. Not yet, just a conversation about alignment. The owner understood what alignment meant. It meant limits. It meant clocks returning to the table. At the meeting, officials spoke calmly about sustainability, fairness, and precedent. They warned that allowing guests to stay indefinitely created imbalance. Other businesses followed rules. Why shouldn't this one? The owner listened, then asked a simple question. No one answered directly. Back in the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted. Word of the meeting spread quietly. Regulars lingered even longer, aware something fragile was being tested. Some ordered less, afraid of causing trouble. Others ordered more, as if to justify their presence. The owner watched it all, feeling the strain of holding space that was no longer invisible. One evening, a guest who had been coming daily approached the counter. They said the restaurant was the only place they could sit without being asked to move along. They didn't say why. They didn't have to. The owner felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper. Hospitality was no longer abstract. It was personal. That clarity landed hard. The owner considered compromise again. Time limits during peak hours. Gentle reminders. Reservations with conditions. Each option would protect the business. Each would fracture the trust that had formed. Hospitality, once conditional, teaches people to measure themselves. That night, the owner made a choice. Nothing would change. No signs posted. No clocks reintroduced. No justifications offered. The restaurant would continue exactly as before. The response was swift and unsentimental. Fines arrived first, modest but persistent. Then warnings. Then the suggestion that continued noncompliance would invite closure. The owner read each notice, filed them carefully, and opened the restaurant the next day exactly as before. Guests stayed, not defiantly, not dramatically. They stayed because they were allowed to, because no one watched the clock, because no one asked them to justify their presence. The room carried a calm that could not be legislated away. People spoke softly. They listened fully. Time regained its original shape. When the final order came, it was brief. The restaurant was closed for operating outside accepted guidelines. There was no public outcry, no protest, no campaign to save it. The owner locked the door, thanked the staff, and walked away without explanation. To many, it looked like failure. To those who had been there, it felt like completion. What followed was quieter and more enduring. Former guests carried the practice elsewhere. They lingered without apology. They offered seats without question. They stopped treating time as something to earn. Cafes noticed people staying longer without asking permission. Homes opened their tables more generously. Hospitality spread, not as policy, but as posture. The restaurant never reopened. It didn't need to. Its defiance was never about permanence. It was about proof. Proof that hospitality could still exist without conditions. That care could resist efficiency without announcing itself. That refusing to hurry people was not laziness, but dignity. In a system built on turnover, this place had chosen stillness. And though it could not survive inside that system, it changed the people who passed through it. Sometimes, hospitality does not win by staying open. It wins by reminding us what we are allowed to offer one another before the doors close. Subscribe to join the journey. When